All right, it's time we talk about the looming time bomb that is the national debt. Hey, everybody, Damon Roberts. Welcome back into another video. I want to remind you that this video, of course, is brought to you by our friend Mike Lindell and MyPillow, mypillow.com. Promo code LFS6B at checkout will save you 10 to 60% off. That's right. It's like the third rail of political discussions over the last 15 years. No one wants to talk about it. The looming national debt. The problem that it is going to become sooner or later. Now, most of you know, even if you don't pay attention to every minutia of what's going on, that our fiscal operating debt has now crossed over $31 trillion. That's right, $31 trillion. But what most of you don't think about are the unfunded liabilities, the promises we've made that we haven't had to pay yet. Do you know how massive our unfunded liabilities are? Do you know that they're approaching $300 trillion? That's right, $300 trillion of unfunded liabilities that the country has. And do you know that they don't even put those on the books? They don't even count. They don't even count. Never mind $31 trillion of fiscal operating debt. Unfunded liabilities that are not on the books, that don't even count, approaching $300 trillion. Now, the fiscal operating debt is $31 trillion, and that's $20 trillion added in just the last 13 years. These programs, folks, are totally out of control. The federal government is totally out of control, and up to now, neither party has been interested in doing a damn thing about it. And we've seen it from both parties. Trillion-dollar infrastructure bills under the last three presidents, more than $1 trillion in some of them. Boondoggles that only some people in some of these areas actually see a benefit from. Most people don't benefit from these programs. And the people who clearly don't benefit are us, our children, and our grandchildren. See, when it comes to spending and debt, politicians on both sides, they always wrap deficit spending and all of this debt, they wrap it in some kind of good intention or good political motive. We've talked about this before. They always need to pan today to be able to sell you the dream of tomorrow. Oh, we're going to tackle the war on poverty, or we're helping this group, or we're going to help that group, or we're building this program up, or we're funding this program, and it's going to be for a better tomorrow. Now, in your own lives, you have to have self-control, or you destroy yourself. You destroy your finances. You destroy your credit, and eventually you destroy your family. But politicians with your money continue to show none of that same self-control. The U.S. national debt now at $31 trillion and rapidly rising as the federal government spends more than it takes in, borrowing money to pay the growing shortfall, taking out more loans to pay off the previous loans. Meanwhile, we have a Federal Reserve that is now raising interest rates to almost 5%, 450 basis points almost in 1 year to deal with inflation. And they've already announced that they're going to keep not only raising here in probably the first 2 months of 2023, but they're going to keep those interest rates high probably throughout the year into next year. Now, the interest on the debt is massive. It's going to take up a bigger and bigger chunk of each annual fiscal budget of the federal government. And it doesn't take a math wizard to figure it out. You could do basic arithmetic. With the national debt exceeding $31 trillion, each percent increase of the federal fund rate translates into over $300 billion in annual interest payments just on the national debt. If the Fed was to raise to a 6% interest rate on $31 trillion in debt, that's $1.86 trillion a year. The federal government is expected to spend $5.9 trillion in 2022, according to the Congressional Budget Office, meaning the interest on the debt would have been 31.5% of total government expenditures this year. There is no political appetite for cutting entitlements or other promised spending. There's just not. Raising income tax rates won't be enough to raise the kind of revenue that we'll need, and hiking taxes during a recession that's soon to come will only make this entire fiasco far worse. And that brings us to today. The Congressional Budget Office just released the final details of federal spending in 2022, and guess what it shows? The federal government had a $1.4 trillion deficit last year, borrowing roughly $82 billion in December alone. Last year's borrowing totals more than $10,000 per household is what it comes out to be. That's right. They borrowed for me and for you and for your friends and for your kids and for your neighbors, whoever owns a house, $10,000 per household and $4 billion per day. The higher debt was fueled in part by a rash of several trillion-dollar additional spending bills since Joe Biden took office. See, folks, this is the real elephant in the room that the ruling class, the media, and unfortunately too many politicians on both sides of the aisle refuse to talk about. We hear about FTX, we hear about Bernie Madoff, but this is the real Ponzi scheme that's being perpetuated on U.S. taxpayers. Initially, spending receives broad support as a response to the pandemic this past year, but later bills by Joe Biden received more opposition from Republicans, but not enough. Biden has touted a reduction in the deficit last year from $2.8 trillion to $1.4 trillion. We hear him say that all the time. And while you can make an argument that's technically true, the $1.4 trillion figure is still much higher than when he took office. And really, the difference, as we talked about, is not really a cut. It's just spending money that was allocated that was never spent. In 2019, the budget deficit was less than $1 trillion. Members of Congress who are serious about the fiscal health of the nation should commit to passing a budget, not engage in new borrowing, and coming up with a reasonable package of savings to help bring our debt down. That's why what has happened here in the House over the last week that we've seen this fight for these rules packages, hopefully when it comes to the debt and the debt ceiling, we'll actually see that pay off. Folks, without changes, the debt and deficit future looks absolutely bleak. The Congressional Budget Office released its economic outlook for the next decade and projected record high debt levels compared to the nation's gross domestic product. That is not a good recipe. The CBO projects that the federal budget deficit will shrink to $1 trillion in 2022. It was $2.8 trillion last year, and that the annual shortfall would average $1.6 trillion from 2023 to 2032, the Congressional Budget Office said. The deficit continues to decrease as a percentage of gross domestic product next year as spending related to the coronavirus pandemic wanes, but then deficits increase, reaching 6.1% of GDP in 2032. The deficit has been greater than that only 6 times since 1946. Cutting government spending and lowering tax rates to grow the economy are lost on the Biden administration. They're more in line with Cloward and Piven. Of course, their strategy was to implement political crisis to achieve a guaranteed annual income. Watch the news today and see their strategy, first published in 1966, is absolutely playing out in 2022 and 2023. Crash the economy, wipe out the middle class savings and wealth, and then rescue, quote unquote, everyone with a guaranteed annual income, barely sufficient enough to cover Joe Biden's ice cream consumption. Folks, that's where we are, and I know this is the third rail of political discussions, but we need to talk about it. The debt is becoming our biggest national security threat, and it's seemingly nobody wants to do it. Fiscal insanity is what we see. There's an old saying that says, when you're in a hole, stop digging. Well, it seems like we're always looking for a bigger shovel. All right, that's going to do it for this one, everybody. Again, visit our sponsor, Mike Lindell, MyPillow, MyPillow.com. Use our code LFS6B at checkout for 10 to 60% off. And I'll see you in the next one.